Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining again. Just letting 1 minute while the waiting room is released and people are able to join us. Guess while we're waiting, I'll just mention briefly, I'm Heather Tanana. I'm the coordinator for the Indigenous Women's Leadership Network, which is a new network that just launched in the past year. So I'll drop it into the chat for us, but we have a website that's live, iwln.org, and you can go to that and link to be able to join the network. And we also post updated events, and I encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram. Those are our two social medias. All right, and we're hoping to be joined by Bitta Becker as one of the chairs of our organization, who is going to be moderating. Not surprising for many of us, especially those out in Indian country, the internet is not always the most reliable. And so we're going to see, let's see if she can get on the phone perhaps. So that's what we're working through right now. If you don't mind, just a little more patience. Otherwise, a couple other things to note that are exciting for the network this year is that in March, we'll also be hosting a media training. So a lot of people who are working in the basin are very aware of, it's quite the hot topic, from droughts to tribal water rights. Many of us who work in the field are being asked to make statements to media or to comment on it publicly. And so we're going to be hosting a two-part media training. The first one will be organized by Matt Mosley, who's an expert in communications and strategies. And then our second session the following week will include a panelist of reporters to give you tips about how to engage in media, get your message across. Okay, so I am going to do one more quick check-in here. Susan, I'm trying to multitask to get this over to Bitta, because for those who don't know Bitta, she is an amazing Indigenous leader in the basin, really long history of working with the Navajo Nation in a lot of different capacities, from their tribal water rights litigation team to National or Navajo Tribal Utility Authority, the Natural Resource Division, and now she is special counsel to the president, Navajo Nation president. So let me just try this one more time. And again, always appreciate everyone being so accommodating while we work out the IT hiccups. So, okay, let's see here. Try that. Just one more time. And in the meantime, oh, yay! I was typing away, Bitta joined. Thanks, Bitta. I was just introducing our wonderful moderator. Again, just such a long history of serving her people and bringing these issues to attention at local, state, federal level. So excited to have Bitta and our panelists. So I'm going to turn it over to Bitta now, and I'll let her then moderate and introduce our wonderful other speakers here. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your patience. We've been having internet problems all morning. But yes, I got on and through my phone, not through a laptop. So, but it's great to see friends as I'm flipping through my phone. Great to see the participants. Thank you for joining us today. So, and I apologize if I'm repeating what Heather's already said, but we're a small group of Indigenous women who were brought together through the leadership of I'm going to call them Matt and Daryl. Of course, that's not their full names, but they're two gentlemen who started something called the Tribes and Water Initiative, Water and Tribes Initiative in the Colorado River Basin. And one of the things, and Daryl's a tribal member, and he's always commented on how, women are really the leaders in Indian country. We don't always have titles, but we are still the leaders. So he asked several of us to get together and try to promote Indigenous women's leadership, especially in the natural resources area. So we've we've had a couple of webinars. Is Nora with us? I'm checking my attendee list. Yes, Nora McDowell, the wonderful Nora McDowell, who many of you know, held a wonderful webinar. And the idea for this one is really to help, especially emerging leaders, learn how to work with allies. Allies are so critical to the work in Indian country. And we'll talk about what is an ally. I don't think that there's one definition. I think that many people can be allies. They can be seen, they can be quietly working behind the scenes, but we'll get into that conversation in a little bit. So this is a tremendous panel. It's intergenerational, multi-gendered, multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-experience. And I'm super excited that they're here today. So I'm just going to call you all by your first names. I'll let you introduce yourselves. But we have Celine, Moy, and Pam, all who are dear friends of mine. And we all met through work. And yet we became friends. And that's kind of a funny way to say it, right? Yet we became friends. But I really think they all embody the concept of allies. And one of the things I think we'll talk about today is how picking up the phone, which is very challenging for young people, I will say that, but sometimes just picking up the phone and having a frank conversation and listening to one another is a way of building allies and allyship. Okay, let me shut up and let each one of them introduce themselves. And what I thought, if it's up to you, if in your introduction, I had suggested that that when you introduce yourself, talk about being an ally. And I know it's a little nerve-wracking for some of you, because I know some of you don't see yourselves this way, but I see you this way. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation. Okay, so let me shut up and let me start with, I'm just going to go in alphabetical order by last name. So let's start with Pam.
Dang it, that's always a problem being an Adams. Hi, everyone. And it's so great to see you all and this panel and to see looking through the attendance list. Hi to old friends that are out there. I've been retired from Reclamation for 1 year now. And I have to say, it's been a great year of playing. I've just been doing all these things I haven't been able to do, doing a long list of chores that needed done. So it's been a great year, but I really appreciate all you all who are still working on these tough Colorado issues. And I read the paper all the time and I think of you all the time going, oh my gosh, I'm so glad they're working on this. I'm so glad it's this great team of people that are tackling these really difficult problems in this really dire circumstances these days. So thank you all for continuing to do that fabulous work. So from my perspective, a federal ally is someone you trust, of course. Without the trust, it doesn't matter who you are or what organization you work for. If you can't trust them, then they're not an ally in my book. But an ally is also the person who's willing to go to battle for you and do the fight and push maybe institutional norms and stir the pot a little bit and kind of really take your side in difficult situations. But then at the same time, a real ally is someone who is honest with you and will say when things can't be done and say, especially from a federal perspective, we have so many constraints, regulatory constraints, administrative constraints, that sometimes we just can't do what we would all like to do. And so an ally can help creatively solve problems and maybe get what you want to get done in a sort of roundabout kind of way. So I think allies are really critical, and as Beta said, they can be at every level, from someone you don't really hear from very often, who is just constantly pushing and getting the work done, to leadership in DC, who are obviously critical to getting things done.
And Pam, I love it. Trust, honesty. Tell our audience a little bit more about what you did with the feds and kind of where you were in the bureaucracy. And of
Sure.
course, the story I want to tell is when we had a friend, one of her first meeting with the tribes, and she came out of it going, okay, yeah, I want you to tell that story.
No, better. You've got to tell from your side. Because it's classic.
I'll tell that story later, but why don't you give our audience a little more about your background and your educational background, and then.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
For the last several years of my career, I was the Native American Affairs Program Manager for the Lower Colorado Basin. So that's for the areas of those who might not be so familiar with reclamation divisions. That's Arizona, California, and Nevada. And Reclamation felt it was important to have a Native American Affairs Program Manager that sits directly under the regional manager, who, so it's a leadership role that's got the direct ear of the regional leadership, because they consider tribes to be such important partners. So I was that for the last couple of years, which was a fabulous follow-on for the work I got to do on the Colorado River Basin study and then the tribal water study, which you can probably talk about in more detail a little bit later. But my training background is I'm a geologist. And to be a geologist, you have to kind of wrap your head around that concept of geologic time. This concept of things is cyclical, the things are constantly changing. And I think because that's sort of my personal philosophy, as well as how I kind of view the earth and everything, I just have a real interest and affinity to peoples and cultures who maybe think of time as more cyclical rather than linear. And so for me, it's been such a pleasure to work with tribal nations over the last, I did it even before I came to Reclamation. And it's been just such an honor and pleasure to work with folks that think differently, maybe than a traditional education might bring. And so it's been my good luck to do that. Is that okay, Betta?
That's great. Thanks, Pam. All right, Celine.
Thanks, Betta. And yeah, I'll start as Pam did. I was just thrilled to receive this invitation. I've been a huge fan of IWLN since it started. We've had some fellows and interns that have been able to work with you from the Nature Conservancy. So this is literally like my favorite speaking invitation I have gotten. So excited to be here. For my background, I am an attorney and environmental scientist by training, which is a little bit of a dangerous combination. I know enough science to ask good questions, but not always answer them. And I have worked both for tribes. I worked in-house for the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and their general counsel's office for many years, including when we started the tribal water study and did the basin study. And I now work for the Nature Conservancy. I've done a few things for the Nature Conservancy since I joined, but I now lead our tribal partnerships work in the Colorado River Basin. And I think I was the one that said, I don't know if I can define an ally right, but I'll do my best. So, I come to this as a panelist who carries a lot of privilege. And I think that an important thing about allies is they recognize their privilege and use it for good. So I am a white woman. I work for a large conservation organization that can bring a lot of money and power into the work that we do. And I think a lot about how we use that in service to our Indigenous partners in the Colorado River Basin. And I also think that it comes with a responsibility to break down some of the deeply inequitable and systemic barriers that we have for tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin. I was doing actually a DEI training for work the other day, and something really struck me that these are problems for everyone, both the people who have sort of built up those inequitable structures and the people that are suffering from them, and that we all have some collective responsibility in building a better future. So that's really how I see myself, and hopefully that, I'm also aware that people who carry privilege like to see themselves as allies, which is why I said, really? Okay.
That's awesome. So I remember I'm probably a decade older than Celine, if maybe 15 years. And so we met when she was working for Ute Mountain. And I remember, like, I remember the feeling when you were so forceful as this young white woman talking about tribal issues in a way that was like the new generation. You know what I'm talking about, Pam, right? Like, we never really, I like to say, in my own personal lived experience, when we talk about water, I don't feel like I ever had a real true water conversation until COVID hit. And people realized like how important water is. It's not just about lake levels, right? I mean, it is so important to our very existence. But I just remember that, Celine, and just really applaud you for your chutzpah. And I just thought, wow, like here's this young woman talking about these issues in a real way that Pam talks about I like to call you all the federales. I guess you're a retired federale, both in the federal system and in just the legal system. It's hard to have those honest conversations, right? Um, the intersection of law and policy. And I think that that's what's so interesting about COVID and Black Lives Matter and climate change and where we are right now. And so, although I went by last name, this was actually more brilliant than I thought, because we're kind of moving through the generations, right? And then we have this amazing young man, Moy, who I'll let him introduce yourself. And I just see just the bridges and the movement, and it's just so exciting to me. So let me pass it to Moy.
Buenos dias. Good morning, everyone. Moises Moreno Rivera. And well, first, I'm really humbled to get the invitation. And just like Celine mentioned, I'm just really thankful. I see some of the folks on the attendees list, and I recognize some of the names, and just thank you for all of your work and for even allowing me to be here. So that's just as a starter. Bitta, I kind of felt that this was payback for asking you to be on the ally panelist for the inaugural Pride Month celebrations that we held within our Natural Resources Agency in Cal EPA. I'm like, who could be who's someone that's a strong ally to the LGBTQIA2S plus community? And we asked Bitta to be on a panel, and now I'm like, is this payback? But this is great. This is great. Paying it forward. My name is Moises, and I humbly serve as the inaugural Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice at the California Natural Resources Agency. Prior to being in this role, I was the Assistant Tribal Liaison to the California Water Boards. And I grew up on Cahuilla land, and grew up just surrounded by awesome humans. And I had the awesome experience of working with tribal youth on advancing Native education rights for Torres Martinez when I was working with them. And it was through that experience that it really opened my eyes that an attack on us, on me, or on Indian country is an attack on all of us, right? And that we need to collectively uplift each other regardless of our identities and regardless of what our background is. So I'm just very thankful and passionate for the work that I get to do in the environmental space, right? Collectively uplifting communities right now. So to be an ally, to answer that question, it's also knowing when to shut up. And I think it's very important to know what your boundaries are, right? And it's important to know when you need to self-educate, right? I have a number of books in my office of, like, before I ask a question that's answerable by any search engine, before I, ask for, guidance, what research am I doing and what self-learning am I doing so that it doesn't yet add additional burden or additional responsibility on the impacted communities, right? So for me, I constantly reading, constantly self-educating, and really and that willingness to learn and unlearn, right? There's practices that a true ally knows to also unlearn, and that when they get called out, that they know how to take a step back and self-educate. So and ditto to what Pam and Selena have shared.
Hold on one sec. Somebody stop stepping in my office. All right, sorry about that, guys. As Heather mentioned, I'm in a whole new role, completely unexpected. I'm in the office of the president. So I love the role because I've been with the Navajo Nation for 20 months. 20 years, except for the 9 months when I worked for California Environmental Protection Agency. And wow, when you're in the office of the president, people return your phone call. Like people who I've worked with for 20 years who would never return my phone call, now they do. But because I'm at this highest level, I'm always at the beck and call of, I'm a servant, right, to the highest elected official. So apologies for that interruption. So one of the stories so we've talked about what an ally is, and I just love what all of you had to say. And we've kind of touched on some of the things that I also wanted to talk about. How do you navigate the workplace as an ally, advice to people just starting out their careers? Because I think what's so interesting to me, and Moy knows this, like my time in California, it was just, I don't even know how to describe it. It was just so refreshing just to be able to talk about these issues in a real way, that because, you heard what Moise's title was, or is within the California government, where they are actively opening up these conversations as part of their policy making, which isn't always happening in other places, right? In certain states or in certain parts of the federal government, even with President Biden's executive order on racial equity, you still have to spend a lot of time educating people. That's a lot. I always, because I was an administrator for natural resources for quite a few years for Navajo. And I used to always say, I spend a lot of my time educating federal agencies and getting federal agencies to get to know each other and to try to talk to each other about Navajo. So I think where I'm going with this is maybe trying to make it, if you feel comfortable sharing a story, I'm going to share. So I've already shared a story about Celine. I'm going to share a story about one of Pam's allies. So this was probably 12 years ago, maybe now. Maybe 12.
Yep. 13.
13 years ago. And so it's, if you can think about that time period and how different it was, where I don't even think DEI was a term anybody, nothing. And the world that Pam and I were working in was very legally centric. Is that a fair way to put it? Right. So you talked about water, not as a source of life, not as the fact that we're made of water, that we live on a blue planet, but we talked about water in a very legalistic way. And that was very frustrating for tribes. And I'm laughing because there are 10 tribes that have a partnership in the Colorado River. And so we had a meeting, and and so the questions came up about something called the Colorado River Basin Study, and were tribes looked at appropriately. And so we had a meeting, and it was a meeting where each tribal leader let the federal government know exactly what they were thinking and feeling. And Pam and I are laughing because there's this wonderful young lady who I won't name, but she walked out of that, I think in tears, saying, this is the hardest meeting I've ever been at. But again, it was like you, Celine, like seeing the new generation come in or seeing Moy come in. She did not retreat. She did not get angry. I mean, really prior to that young lady at the federal government, I was just so used to people saying that tribes don't know what they're talking about. Who cares what their concerns are? Because it's not framed in the way we talk about these issues, right? It always has to be about the legal aspect of water, not about what it really means to us. But what Pam and I are chuckling about it because, man, did she become an ally to the point where several years later, this is what I will really, really never forget, is we were meeting with high level reclamation officials who are wonderful people. And this young lady who she'd really become an ally with the tribes came up to us after the meeting and started apologizing for what her leadership was saying because they are so tone deaf. And I just thought, wow, isn't that like here? I'm feeling it. I'm touching it like this generational shift. So even though it is a story about me, but it's kind of just me watching allies develop and grow. And I think, Pam, I would have to venture to guess you were part of the whole behind the scenes stuff we don't see, which is, okay, let's not pick up on the emotion. Let's listen to the words. I mean, the emotion, you want to pick up on the emotion in terms of this is clearly very important to people, but why is there this level of frustration with the tribes? How are we not listening? What is not happening? And Moise's point about sometimes you just have to shut up, right? Sometimes you really just have to listen and not take things personally and distance yourself from this stuff, right? So, Pam, you're unmuted, probably by accident, but would you like to start with maybe a tangible kind of a story that you feel comfortable sharing?
Sure. I think the time that I was at Reclamation, maybe starting and working with travel issues, probably starting 2010 till I retired, I saw, certainly in the Colorado River Basin, a very, very big cultural shift that people finally started thinking about tribes and thinking about sharing knowledge and information and not always, we've talked all about this with everybody else. Maybe we should talk about it with the tribes. So there was a real culture shift. And, but like any culture shift, particularly in an entrenched institution like the federal government, it takes work to shift it. And there are multiple people that were that constant push to kind of make that change and to recognize that tribes are important, and whose leadership and reclamation leadership and interior leadership recognized that tribes are critical partners and we have to be included early. And it was really a pleasure for me to see that change.
Before I move on to somebody else, when you think back of that, any tips for us in Indian country, how we can help you, like things that you like, how can we help with this shift?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I was thinking about that. And I think one thing that's important, and I thought the 10 Tribes Partnership did a beautiful job on it when we were working on the tribal water study, is in front of leadership, they would thank the reclamation team and thank the really the whole team for working on the tribal water study. So it's acknowledging the importance of that to the tribal leadership as well as to reclamation leadership. And I think that's an important, easily forgotten step. But it's important because it allows particularly DC leadership because they're so busy, they got a million things on their mind and they might forget, for instance, tribal water study, like what's that? Who really cares about that? That's something I got briefed on 2 months ago. But to be bringing it up in meetings and constantly thanking Reclamation for doing this and acknowledging the hard work of all the teams, the tribal teams as well as the federal teams, I think is a good help.
I appreciate that, because I think another theme there is at the end of the day, we're still human beings. We love to pretend we're not natural beings, part of the natural world, but that relationship, right, is so important. And to your point, yeah, it is sometimes a reminder to people who are at the highest levels, running a million miles an hour, that right, their relationships, there's hard people working on this. They're part of my team. All right, let me turn. I'm just going to keep going in the same order. So, Celine, do you have a story you want to share with us?
Yeah, I'm having a hard time between two, but and I hope it's okay if I talk about a different hat that I've worn, which is not something I did for the Nature Conservancy, but I'm just finishing 2 terms serving on the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is the state sort of policy making body within Colorado. And I saw a pretty incredible change in how some of that state's water leadership looked at tribal matters within the Colorado River Basin. And I think it was important that I was serving on the board when that happened. And so I think that, when we think about what it's like to have someone serve on a board who understands tribal water issues, that can make a huge difference in helping an agency that has good intentions, but maybe not enough experience, start to think about what it might be like to build tribal partnerships. And I think for me, the greatest part of the trajectory of my 6 years on the board is when I got kicked out of the meetings. Like, they didn't need me to be the buffer between the state officials and the tribal folks anymore, because they had formed their own friendships. And I was like, wow, that is like success if I've ever heard it.
That's awesome. I love the idea of like being a voice where there is no representation. But I also want to flip that on its head, especially for Indian country. So last night, I had to step off of a board of a nonprofit, and we tried very hard to make it Navajo, majority Navajo. And I had to step off because of my new position. But point of the story is, one of the conversations we had is we're going to have to be open to having non-Navajos on the board. There just aren't enough of us yet in the varied areas of expertise we need. So, like, for instance, a CPA. I mean, how many Navajo CPAs are there? I only know 3, right? I mean, and there's more than that, but there's not a lot more than that, right? So I think also the idea of allies being comfortable being in a community where they may not be, where they may be there to help, like a tribal entity or a tribal organization or a tribal member run organization. I think I don't want to lose sight of that, because it's still so critical out in my neck of the woods. And I'm looking at Pam, her thoughtful look on her face, like I just think of how many times over the years Reclamation has stepped in to help Navajo on very technical issues, because we didn't have anybody. Even though we probably have the biggest, most sophisticated water department in all of Indian country, there's still, the minutia is where sometimes we can't focus our energies. All right, Moy, I'm dying to hear your story. And you've already hinted at growing up in community, but love to hear what you're thinking.
Yeah, this one's tough, because the story of how I was put, at least in my previous capacity, it was like, oh, you've worked for a tribe, therefore you will be our assistant tribal liaison. And that's how that happened. And at first I was like, well, this is very interesting, how the thought process came to be. And after experiencing that, then it was like, well, we have a tribal advisory committee at Cali, PA. This was when I was there. We have a tribal advisory committee, and they have partnerships, and they know how to essentially do the thing that I'm being asked to do, yet I have the title to be able to effectuate the change. And I've been put in this position to do that. And I remember having conversations with some of the Tribal Advisory Committee members, and they're like, well, we want quarterly reporting out of your board on the cultural uses of water. And we want you to present on a quarterly basis. And we want a website where you post this information. And we want to make sure that there's transparency. And we want to make sure we do that. And at first I was like, whoa, this is going to be fun. This is going to be a fun ride. And then we made it happen. And then we normalized the reporting. We normalized the conversation. We got to train folks across the agency. We really, the foundations were there. And it was really with this openness of, I've been put in this role, I'm in this role, but it's your guidance and leadership that really should be fulfilling what the needs are throughout. And it was that opportunity where we were able to get into that direction. And I now go back and I look at what was developed during that time when I was there. And it was really because the Tribal Advisory Committee, that's, the members in that committee, that's what they had envisioned for our board. And that's what they had envisioned for transparency and process. And I had the ability to do it. Internally, it was a lot of reminding folks of executive orders and reminding folks of our new policy and, and working with leadership and going around folks and, calling TAC members is like, please send a letter. It would be helpful if we heard it from this person. It would be helpful if we heard it from that person. Please attend this meeting. Ask this question this way. It was a lot of grassroots organizing, really. And now there's materials. There's been a whole process, and I could look back and say all of this really happened because there was an openness of dialogue and a willingness to do the work, and for the folks to have trust that we could deliver. And I say we because it was a collective, right? So I think that's one of the proudest things that I got to be a part of, and a lot of it just had to do with folks asking whether I could do the work or not, and then delivering on it.
I loved how both Celine and Pam just got the biggest smile when you said reminding people of executive orders, and right? Because I think that segues really nicely into giving people advice on how do you navigate the workplace? How do you help be a culture shifter in your workplace? How do you I love the word normalize. I think, when I think back over my career, 20 years since becoming a lawyer, and a few years before that, that was always the complaint, was our issues are ghettoized, right? They're ghettoized, which is why nobody wants to seriously talk about and now it really is normalized. I mean, Pam, Celine, Moy, you all talked about the normalization of these issues. So advice, and especially because I'm looking at the invite list and I don't know everybody, but I think some of these folks are pretty, starting out their careers, because it's so different than when I started. So let me give you the advice. I had the good fortune of working for the first federal Latina judge ever in the history of the United States. And what was her advice to me when I started? You're going to have to work harder, longer, right? Right, Moy shaking his head. He's heard that thing too, right? But it is what it is. Don't complain about it, because you're capable. But the only way you're going to be able to compete with the white men is if you work harder and longer than they do. And I'm fascinated to hear what's the conversation now? Is that still what we're saying? Is it different? How do you navigate the workplace? So I'm going to reverse order this, because I'm kind of curious to start with our youngest member, and then see what he's telling folks that he supervises who comes into this space.
This is an interesting question to pose, because navigating the space, I mean, when you're dealing with environmental justice, right? When we're talking about environmental justice, the first environmental injustice was genocide and the forceful removal of native lands, and then everything that comes after, right? So when we're really thinking about that, navigating that space, is I have a strong partnership with our Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs, right? This is an issue that I'm faced with. However, it's on someone's traditional homelands. So how do we navigate this together, right? And how do I make sure that I'm including tribal communities and you're including tribal governments and tribal communities, right? So how are we separating that work stream? And at the same time, how are we bringing our colleagues in this process? And it's long conversations over and over. And you attend this meeting, I'll attend that meeting. We'll both say this at this meeting. When we're speaking with department heads, having our general counsel and having briefed the general counsel that they know to back us, right? And always having the general counsel with us and having our special counsel with us. Because at the end of the day, there's still a lot of risk aversion. And that risk aversion is we don't want to get sued, right? So while my counterpart and myself are advancing on policy, the question always comes as, is this legally sound? And having the attorney right there with us is to back up our statements. And while at times it's thank you for being here, I wish we lived in a time where we didn't have to have the attorney with us at every single meeting where we're trying to advance policy. So it's a lot of pre-meeting before we actually meet to do the thing that we're supposed to do. And I realize that I have a lot of pre-meetings before we actually get things done, just so that we know who's on first, just so that we know who's gonna say what, when, and why. And I feel like that's a lot of my day-to-day on a number of different policy areas. Does that answer your question, Bita?
No, it totally does. Again, it's that whole pick up the phone, have the conversation with people. Yeah, I mean, just have frank conversations sometimes with people, and thinking of the conversation before you walk into the room, right? Who is going to say this thing? Are we aligned? Because I do think, to your point about legal soundness, it is a shift, right? The law is very conservative and slow to move, and DEI efforts it's a forward-leaning, policy shift, and so you do want to be thinking about, okay, even though this person is on our team, they have a very different perspective than we do. So how is that person thinking about it? Let's think about this. Let's work together to help move that person along. That is invaluable advice that I don't think enough people get it, because I've been in meetings with young folks, and we've had federal partners, and we'll talk about, okay, let's pass some drafts back and forth. And I was in a meeting once where I was working with a young lawyer who didn't know you could do that. Like, she didn't know that you could just, right, Pam, you're laughing. Like, exactly. Like, they thought it was literally like, I have to deliver you this formal mean letter. And then it's like, no, we don't. We really can set the stage before you're taking final action, right? All right, let me get here, Celine, and then we'll go to Pam.
Yeah, and I think that sort of how I navigate the workplace might depend on sort of what it is. So within a conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy, like, we want to do good in the world, we want to do good work, we want to work in alignment with communities. So a lot of the work there is just trying to figure out sort of how we're going to do the partnerships. A lot of it is about having to suppress our instinct to want to lead the work and to really think about how we co-create, and to help people think about, we'll do bigger, better work if we take the lead of our Indigenous partners. Like, but how do I see us as like the accelerant. Like, our tribal partners have a great idea, but they might be lacking technical capacity or project management. So within that space, that's a lot of what I do. The other thing that I want to mention is that water management in the Colorado River Basin has a long ways to go to be a psychologically safe people for a young Indigenous woman to come in and feel like they're seen. And I feel like when I'm in spaces outside of the Nature Conservancy, I do occasionally have to play the role of like calling out the racist comment. Like, we are still, as a water management community, working on becoming better on these issues. And so I feel like maybe I've just been here long enough, or I've always had this chutzpah to say, like, wait a minute, like that really shouldn't go unchecked anymore. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, and sometimes it's unknowing. Like, and that's one of the things that I really want to focus on, which is, and we all, this is common. We all know this, the toughest racism to combat is the one that's not explicit, right? And that's implicit, that we don't know, right? And that whole idea of implicit bias. So I'm on the Water and Tribes Initiative, and I don't know who it was, but I remember sitting at home and some mainstream male. Okay, so if you don't know, there are various tribes in the Colorado, well, all tribes have struggled with getting a water allocation and putting their water to use. And it's a spectrum of needs. But if you were following the COVID headlines, you heard about how COVID ravaged the Navajo Nation, in part because we have lack of access to clean drinking water. And I want to underscore, what I'm saying has been endorsed by the federal government in the tribal water study. Like, you pick that up, and there's an admission by everybody that tribes have not had the opportunity to develop like the mainstream. So that's the background. And this is the Water and Tribes Initiative. And even in that group, somebody said over email, well, our allocation system has worked really, really well. It's a success. I know, I'm watching Pam like laugh. And it's like, right, it's a success for who? And so I had to like chime in. It has not been a success for Navajo, for blah, 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 blah. So I think, Celine, that is an important role of allies, to open up the door, to let that voice be heard, and then to turn the table over, or let those people speak for themselves. But it can be intimidating. It's easier for me because I have a law background, so I can do this stuff, right? I get that. And that's, definitely a privilege, my gosh, to get through law school and pass the bar. And I think that that's something we need to remind ourselves of too in our community. Like, remember, it always cracks me up when I'm talking to my colleagues and I'm like, okay, stop the whining. Like, we got through law school. We're state barred. Like, stop. Like, we have to move things forward. So Pam, curious to hear what you're thinking after you've heard these comments and thinking on your long, successful career.
Thanks. Well, I really support this idea of pre-meetings and briefings and getting everyone in place as much as you can before the actual meeting where you're really going to talk about things. And I will quote one of my mentors in the basin, Terry Folk, who very much had this philosophy of no surprises. So he really believed that when you're going into a meeting, when you're trying to get things done, you do not want to surprise somebody with something that's just going to make them react and perhaps blow the action totally away. That it's really critical to try to bring people along. But my experience when you're really trying to shift the culture, you've got to stir the pot some, and you've got to have some confidence to speak up and confidence to maybe not have people agree with you, and maybe have people someday not like you so much because you're perhaps pointing out a little thorn or something. So that's a challenge, and especially in institutions that are not particularly proactive and not early adopters like the federal government. And if we talk about things, pre-meetings and all this coordination, collaboration, and bringing people along is so critical. But I have to say that I had challenges with things working in the federal government because I'm pretty much a border collie by personality. And if somebody has a great idea or there's some kind of problem, I go, let's fix it. Let's do it better. Let's change it. And it's difficult sometimes for me to have to coax people along until sometime later they acknowledge that it's a good idea. And we all know everybody just processes things differently, but sometimes my instinct would be, let's just fix it. Let's just get it done. So that's a way of not to do things sometimes, because it's not always a successful plan.
Yeah, and I think, especially this is true in all governments, but especially the feds, like the stay in your lane, right? This is the extent of your authority. But I think and I don't think it's just tribal communities. I think it's all people after COVID are scratching their heads and saying, wait a second, we need a more holistic approach to our problems, right? Like, Mother Nature is still in charge, but we seem to have ignored her at our peril, right? For so long. So I think this brings us to the end of the questions I had thrown out. So, I had thrown out some questions for the panelists before. I was curious if there was anything any of you wanted to pick up on that you heard from another panelist that you wanted to flesh out. And if not, I'm a chatter. I can chat forever.
If you don't mind, I just have a few thoughts. It was based on your quick question about what advice would you have for young people coming into the workplace, and I came up with two things that really affected my career. And one of them was a mentor. I had a supervisor who said, read the reports. If you read the reports and read the information, this was some years ago, you're 90% ahead of everyone. I would say these days, if you actually read the report and read the information, you're 98% ahead of everyone. And I know it can be difficult, especially with complex technical reports, but really just read the report. And if you don't understand it, which is really understandable with these complex Colorado River Basin reports, sometimes just reach out and ask someone. There are many people that can help answer questions and who are totally willing from a federal perspective. I know from a tribal perspective, that they'll be glad to help explain background information. So reading a report is reports, I think, is critical. And the other one is when you see an interesting project, to volunteer for it. I know when I had been in reclamation just a couple of years, and I heard about this Colorado River Basin study that Terry Fulp was leading, and who was the regional manager at the time. And I kept telling my boss, I really want to work on that because I love long-term planning. I want to work on that. And she didn't do anything to advocate for me. And so finally, it was one Christmas holiday, like 2009, and I just happened to see Terry in the hall, and he kind of knew me, but not really. And I said, Terry, I would really love to work on this project, this study. It's really what I love to do. And so we chatted for a bit, and like 2 weeks later, I was the outreach coordinator, and he said, I really need you to work with tribes, because the study had kicked off with a kind of rough start. So, I couldn't have been happier and luckier, but it was only because I reached out to Terry directly and volunteered to do the work. So those are my two pieces of advice for someone new coming in.
Well, I love that, because just the other night, my 13-year-old daughter and I lay down to go to sleep still. And I forget what she was complaining about, but I was like, sweetheart, if there's any advice, if I can pass on one thing for you, it's that you need to focus on yourself. Don't worry about the noise, and move forward in your own lane, which is exactly what you did, Pam. It's like, okay, nobody's going to advocate for me. I'm smart, I'm passionate, and this is exactly where my knowledge can be, right? What I can be doing. I love that. To this day, too many adults come to me, and I'm like, go have a conversation. Nobody is going to come on down from high and fix these problems for you. Yeah, no, I that's just, yeah, so important. Moyer, Celine, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, and maybe I saw a question from Morgan in the chat, and I think maybe my piece of advice applies regardless of where you are in your career. I think we spend so much time sort of like building relationships above us until we like get into those high positions of power. And I think that we need to be spiders. We need to be building our professional networks all around us with our peers, but particularly with the people that are coming in, because those are going to be our future leaders. And I've had experiences where I was completely ignored because I was 20 years too young to do something. And I've also had an experience now having, someone who was on this webinar earlier join my team, and like, she was like, you don't know about Canva? Like, this is how we design things these days. And I was like, oh my God, you're doing everything on the graphic design for our team now. So that's my piece of advice.
To that question on for older folk, I think extending an arm to the younger folk and to the other folks, I think one of those things, and I have no idea how many people have reached out to me, and vice versa. Folks that are younger, I've always thought that we need to pay it forward. So for me, every single job that I've had students work with me. I've had fellows, interns. I'm looking outside of my office door and my fellows out there. There was no fellowship program in my office when I got here, and I created one because I'm like, we need to pay it forward. So for folks that have been here longer, is you have so much knowledge. You have so much, whether it's knowledge about how the office runs, knowledge about the policy area, knowledge about the generational aspects. I learned from when I got to my role. I knew that there was an environmental justice policy here from 2003, but I was the first one with the title to actually enforce that policy. There was someone who had been working here for 20 years who said, I remember the documents and all of the feedback that leadership gave, and I have those files. Would you want them? And I'm like, of course. I took notes. I was there. I was a student then, and I was tasked with taking all the notes for all of those conversations. I'm going to send that to you because it might be useful for your efforts. And I couldn't thank them enough, right? I couldn't thank them enough. And it created its own level of partnership that I couldn't have imagined otherwise.
No, I think that's brilliant. And the only thing I would add to this is I went to Georgetown University, and as you can imagine, there are not many Native students. There's some, but not when I was there, definitely. And my English professor, my freshman English professor, I saw him as a sophomore. He had a freshman Native student, and he was just befuddled and befuddled by her. And so he stopped me one day and asked me questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Maybe pitch them out before you ask them. Make sure you're not unintentionally offending somebody. But he had to bring himself down as a Georgetown University professor and be like, I don't know what's going on. And then he's like, walks me through a couple things. I'm like, oh, here's what's going on. And then he tracked me down later. He said, you were absolutely right. So don't be afraid to ask questions, share your institutional knowledge. And yeah, as Moy said, pay forward. There's only one planet. There's only one Mother Nature. We've only got one chance to do this right. So we need to be sharing our knowledge across generations. All right. Well, I think mission accomplished, friends. I loved chatting with you, my little curated team. I hope you guys stay in touch with each other. You guys are amazing. You are allies, and we'll all continue to be doing this wonderful work. Thank you to our participants. Nora, we see you, we love you. And I'm going to have to sign off and get to that phone that's ringing. Oh, if you all want to stay on, there's another question that came on. Please do, but unfortunately I got to jump. So bye everybody. Go net.
All right. Thank you, Bida, so much. And also to all of our panelists, such a fun conversation to listen in on. There was a second comment about small business owners, entrepreneurs, in Navajo Nation. And there's a couple other groups. So our network, Indigenous Women's Leadership Network, we are focused on natural resources, particularly water, environmental issues in the basin. There are a couple organizations out there who are focused on business and entrepreneurs and women. And so if you email me, I can't remember the contact off of the top of my head, but email me heather.tanana@law.utah.edu, because that's another emerging field and a really great network to connect in with. So if you'll do that, I can follow up and get you the contact info, because they also do their own networking and programming. But otherwise, yes, thank you so much. And follow our website, LinkedIn, all of that. We'll post our next events. Okay, great. Sasha, probably your name is flipped. I'll do it. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, Roy.